Hi, I'm Jay Edidin.
And I'm Miles Stokes.
And we're the hosts of Jay and Miles Explain the X-Men, a weekly podcast all about the ins, the outs, and the retcons of comics' greatest superhero soap opera.
We're also the hosts of Jay and Miles Review the X-Men,
which you're watching right now,
where we talk about the X-books that come out each week.
This week, we're looking at the books of December 21st and 28th, 2016. I should say, by the way, that we generally don't do these when there's just one book. We just lump it into the next week's. So I think these are going to be bi-weekly for at least the next little while until Resurrection starts to pick up, and we once again have, a dozen books a week or so. First up is the 10th and final issue of X-Men 92, written by Chad Bowers and Chris Sims, with art by Alti Fermentia and Corey Hampshire, and colors by Matt Milla and Dono Sanchez Almara. So this is the final issue of a series that, for us, has been started out extremely strong and has been a much more mixed bag following that. I should also qualify the series as co-written by my best friend, Chris Sims, biased, etc. And as conclusions go, how it mostly feels, at least to me, is premature. I mean, this to me reads like creative teams rushing to wrap up plot lines that were supposed to unspool over a much longer time.
That said, I think given the deadline to finish up the series, which I know was not something the writers were initially aware of, they do a really good job of bringing it all together, of bringing back some plot elements from previous storylines, like the Darkholds, the big supernatural book thing that factored into the vampire storyline, and basically just cramming in all the heroes and villains into one epic climactic battle that feels very, very 90s in a way that I enjoyed.
It feels like it should be a 4-part series in the animated series in really good ways.
Ideally a better 4-part series than Beyond Good and Evil, which was what was initially supposed to wrap up the animated series, which was a terrible storyline involving Apocalypse with this fake little world and people fighting on this road in the middle of nowhere. It was not good. It was
not quite
bad.
the Phoenix Saga, but I would put it up with the stronger episodes and storylines of the animated series in general, I think.
This story here? Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I think it was damn solid, and I think as far as a book that was paying homage to the strengths and weaknesses of the 90s, it captured that.
Yeah, in general, Bowers and Sims did a fantastic job of capturing that spirit of, I guess, effervescent excess. Lots of pecs.
Excess.
Yeah, excess. Lots of pecs, lots of guns, lots of just gleeful high action. Fermentia in particular has just been a stunning asset on this book, and again, this is a creative team I would love to see continue to work together because they're so well suited to each other's styles. Hampshire, who drew the Scott and Jean issue, I think number 5, and also draws those sequences in this, is fine, and this is very much like All New Wolverine in that it feels unfair to judge anyone against Alti Fermentia because she just so exquisitely and perfectly nails the look for this book. Hampshire's okay. He's fine. He doesn't stand up well in comparison, but I honestly don't think there's another artist who would.
Plot-wise, there was a lot to like here, I thought.
Yeah.
I mean, when you have a big climactic battle, what of course it comes back to, for me at least, is the last scene before the M-Chron crystal blows up reality when Age of Apocalypse starts. With the end of all things approaching. And so one of my favorite scenes here was one with Rogue and Gambit. When Gambit's like, Rogue, let me tell you how I feel. And she's like, no way, sugar. Let me know once the world's not ending and there are actually consequences to your words.
Yeah.
Which was a nice alternate take on the X-Men Volume 2, number 41 scene, which is one of my favorite scenes in all of X-Men. I enjoyed seeing sort of a counterpoint to the romantic way that went down.
Yeah, also the abrupt sort of Cable reunion stuff.
Oh, the whole, Summers family making up because time travel love?
Just kind of out of nowhere.
It was heartwarming and also very 90s.
It was heartwarming, and I was going to say, having just discussed Cable and the retcons around him, really felt true to the spirit of the era. Honestly, that's been this book's greatest strength and greatest weakness. It feels like the good part is that it really feels like the early 90s. The bad part is that it really feels like the early 90s. That said, it's a pretty delightful homage. It's worth picking up if that's an era that you enjoy or that you want to get a feel of, or if you're a fan of the X-Men or came into the X-Men via the animated series. Obviously, this is the last issue. It's not a jumping on point.
In fact, there's an editor's note that specifically references that fact.
But looking at this overall, and I think this is also a series that's going to hold up much better in trade than it did in issues, where being able to marathon through it all is actually going to be a huge asset. So, overall, I'd say we recommend this one. As far as the issue, by now you know if you're enjoying the book. We certainly have.
To go back a week to last week, let's go to Uncanny X-Men number 16, written by Cullen Bunn with pencils by Edgar Salazar, inks by Ed Tadeo and Edgar Salazar, and colors by Nolan Woodard. So, this is the first of our many Inhumans versus X-Men tie-ins.
Some of those guys. Some other Marvel people versus X-Men. We don't really pay attention to the rest of them.
And it actually reminds me a great deal of the way that some of the Avengers versus X-Men tie-ins were handled. Much like the tie-ins to that event, the tie-ins to this event seem to be going into greater detail about things we've seen in the main series or showing alternate takes on those major events.
Likewise, like those tie-ins, the extent to which these stand alone varies. This is one that I think is not, you're probably going to be able to limp along with it if you haven't been reading Inhumans versus X-Men, which you should be, by the way. That crossover, or that series is way better than it has any reasonable right to be. This is going to be one that's harder to follow without it.
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly a tie-in rather than a standalone that happens to be related to the event. That said, as such, I think it's a lot of fun. This goes into greater detail as far as one of my favorite events from Inhumans vs. X-Men so far, which was Jean Grey mind-locking Karnak to keep him out of the big fight by having him repeat the same events over and over. And we see a very different side of this in this issue, namely that she's basically got him stuck in the world. The sort of Weapon 13... Well,
she's literally got him stuck in the world.
Exactly. Not
just basically.
Weapon 13 Fantomex related, like, world within a world that we spent so much time in Grant Morrison's run. And it's kind of fascinating, largely because we learned something we didn't know in Inhumans vs. X-Men, which is that Jean's working with Fantomex, or rather the Stepford Cuckoos are, who has a completely different goal. And I like that because it's very much Fantomex's style to piggyback on something noble to kind of do his own thing.
I really appreciated how smoothly this Fantomex bridged the original version, who we all came to know and love in his amazing Danger Diabolique ridiculousness, and the thoroughly unhinged Fantomex of Cy Spurrier's X-Force. Like, right. This one feels like a seamless marriage of those two in ways that I really enjoy. Fantomex is a character who should absolutely be chaotic neutral. He acts in self-interest. Sometimes that lines up with the good guys. Sometimes it doesn't. He doesn't particularly care and has a moral compass that he just doesn't pay attention to and has no real connection to. And this is... And fun. He should be 3 steps ahead of everyone else at all times. And still, fallible mostly by way of his own ego. And man, this issue takes him in a really fun direction and sows the seeds for some even better ones. Yeah.
Now, this issue is interesting in that it's an Uncanny X-Men issue, and the main characters are Jean Grey, the Stepford Cuckoos, and Fantomex. Jean Grey and the Stepford Cuckoos haven't really been Uncanny characters, and Fantomex only barely has in this iteration of the title. But that works for me, because here in Inhumans vs. X-Men, we do see all the mutant teams overlapping more, so this is thematically consistent with that principle.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things Inhumans vs. X-Men was supposed to do and has been doing is shake up the status quo and shake up the way the teams are oriented. I mean, we've seen the teams that are going to come out of this in Resurrection, and no, I refuse to call it anything else. And yeah, it makes sense to me that shifting and shaking is starting to happen now.
Absolutely. Now, I don't know if we're going to see much in the way of Fantomex in Resurrection. I don't believe he's listed on any of the teams, but I do hope he turns up.
I have trouble imagining how effective he could effectively be on any of the teams, given how this issue ends.
Right. Well, he's a sneaky kind of guy. He's very sneaky. He's roguelike. And not in the randomly generated dungeon sense that I know of.
Well, he's and also not in the touch mutation sense.
That too.
Sugar.
But yeah, whether he shows up later as an antagonist or as an unpredictable, dangerous ally, this version of Fantomex, this version that, like you said, is halfway between Morrison and Spurrier's takes on the character, this is one I want to see more of, just because things are always going to be... Well, they're never going to be boring with this guy.
Finally, we've got Extraordinary X-Men number 17, written by Jeff Lemire with pencils by Eric Koda, inks by Tom Palmer, and colors by Maury Hollowell. And I think, based on what we've talked about before, I think I'm speaking for both of us when I say that this is easily the best issue of this run of Extraordinary X-Men to come out.
This issue was stellar. Like, the level of emotional impact here, we haven't really seen post-Secret Wars much at all.
And especially not in this specific title. This is a book that is not primarily from the X-Men's perspective. It is from the perspective of a sibling of one of the mutants who they've taken to X-Haven. And it examines, we've seen a lot of the X-Men stuff has focused, very much on the X-Men as a unit in a kind of solipsistic way. It's the X-Men is the X-Men focusing on mutant issues mostly as they affect the X-Men. How they're seen by the rest of the world is something that we saw very briefly post 8-month gap in the first arc of All New X-Men and really haven't seen touched on since in any of the titles until now. And the role that the X-Men play in the mutant community, and especially Storm, gets some play here that I think it's been needing for a very, very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Just looking at the X-Men as these icons, as these heroes, as these almost untouchable archetypes, that kind of gets across something very important, which is that the X-Men mean something to a lot of people in Earth 616, in the world in which these comics take place, similarly to what they mean to people in our world, the real world, which I used to know the Earth designation of the real world, but I forgot it.
It's probably been destroyed and recreated a few times since.
Yeah, most likely. But yeah, I mean, getting to see the X-Men both as people in some scenes, but also as just as larger than life to these people who can, to this narrator, this young woman who can barely get their attention to talk to her dying sister, that's heavy. That works.
Yeah. As for the rest of the issue, the line art... So I had a lot of trouble with the inks in this issue. I thought the inks detracted significantly, and the strongest pages, the strongest panels, were the ones that were pretty obviously colored directly over pencils, which is unfortunate. I'm not super familiar with any of the art team, so I can't really speak to that with any degree of expertise. But yeah, I think the inks stripped away a lot of expressiveness that this issue needed. That said, the storytelling was still strong. The colors, again, ended up carrying a lot of the weight and did a pretty good job doing that. Line art was either reasonably good or really far off with very little that went beyond that. The writing was terrific. Lemire, this is the second issue that I've really loved of this series, and like the first one, whose number I don't remember, which was the montage issue, it's essentially a standalone. Essentially a one-shot. And that's been... Yeah, and this is a lovely issue. And honestly, if you're not picking up this book, this is an issue that stands alone very well and that I would highly recommend to anyone to whom the X-Men have meant a lot over time. Because, as you mentioned, what they mean within their world and the resonance they have for young mutants, and especially, for a young black mutant girl, will, I think, resonate very, very strongly with, people in the real world to whom these stories mean a lot.
Yeah, and I mean, that part, it's a punch to the heart in a lot of ways. Like, you could say it uses cheap tricks, but when something uses those cheap tricks so effectively, like, I'm completely okay with that. I mean, the fact that this dying young mutant girl had even chosen a code name for, her fantasy where she got to become one of the X-Men, like,
and that looks outrageous, but how many of us have?
Oh, right. Jeez.
Like, how many kids who grew up watching X-Men cartoons came up with code names? How many people, have their G.I. Joe names or whatever? Yeah.
And in a world where the X-Men existed, that would, I think, be triply so. And so seeing Storm, who's been so preoccupied by, duty, by being the face of mutant kind, by having to decide what to do with the Terrigen Cloud, remember what the X-Men represent and what she represents just to individual people, including children. For me, that brings back the compassion and the humanity to Aurora that's been so sidelined throughout all of Extraordinary X-Men.
This also really effectively contextualizes some of the decisions we've seen her make in Inhumans vs. X-Men.
Oh, absolutely. It raises the stakes and it makes them personal and it makes them feel real in a way that they haven't fully before.
So, out of those 3 books, I'm guessing that our pick of the week is pretty obvious, but Miles, do you want to go ahead and make it formal?
Let's make it as formal as an X-Men themed bow tie, which is to say formal, but maybe slightly inappropriate. It's absolutely Extraordinary X-Men number 17. This was a stellar standalone issue, and while it wasn't firing on every single cylinder, the cylinders it did fire on, it fired hard. That might make a car explode. I don't know cars well enough to say for sure. But regardless, I mean, I feel like maybe it's becoming a cliche for me to have to hold back tears at work because of X-Men on my lunch break, but this was definitely one of those issues.
I mean, that's basically how we live. That's
is our
pretty
world.
much been our world for a real long time.
Yeah, I would say 2.5 years, but no, well before the podcast as well. But yeah, it cuts to the core of who Storm is. It cuts to the core of who the X-Men are, but more importantly, what they mean. It adds to an existing big X-Men event without requiring knowledge of it to be effective. Like, this is what you should do for a tie-in, and honestly, this is what you should do for an issue of X-Men, period. Full stop. So, that said, what is our favorite panel of the week?
Well, our panel of the week is also, I think, fairly unsurprisingly from Extraordinary X-Men number 17. Technically, it's 3 panels, but they're all part of the same 2-page splash. And this is a really effective page for a lot of reasons. First, I just want to take a moment to look at the layout of it, and then the way those two the reading diagonal and the diagonal of the way the people are arranged in the panel cross, and just how elegantly that balances out the page. But second and more important, sometimes the impact of the moment is most powerful, not in the action, but in the reaction to it. And seeing the framing moments of Storm, but having the actual climax be just all of, these incredibly powerful people around her just freezing to look at the sky. That plays really well, and it was a really, really good creative choice, and as such, it's a very, very, very powerful panel.
So that is it for this fortnight. Thanks for watching.
If you like what you've seen here, but think it would be way better without our faces, check out our podcast, Jay and Miles Explain the X-Men. New episodes go up every Sunday at explainthexmen.com, also on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. Miles, what have we got for them this week?
Oh boy. Well, we are officially here, having successfully, we hope, introduced him in the last episode. We have come at long last to the first appearance of Cable. And boy howdy, if we ever had any doubts that we were getting into the 90s, here they come, jumping sideways while firing 2 guns into the air and yelling, "Ah!"
That podcast, these video reviews, and everything at explainthexmen.com are brought to you by our Patreon subscribers. We are an entirely listener-supported podcast, and those are the folks who help us stay on the air and entirely ad-free. If you want to join their ranks, which you totally should, you can do that at the link either above or below this video, depending on where you're watching.
And in the meantime, we will see you along with some robot arms, robot eyes, robot guns, and robot pouches this weekend, and here back in YouTube land in a couple of weeks.
Next year.
Yes, next year in the brave new 2017 world of more X-Men. Always X-Men, forever X-Men. But not X-Men Forever, because that was its own thing and that series ended. So there you have it.
So, you know what my favorite thing about the X-Men 92 art is?
There are so many options, but what?
Okay, well, Fermench is amazing anyway, but the cartoonier style means that I can use it for one of my very, very favorite recreational abuses of iPhone technology.
You mean...
Which is Snapchat face swaps.
Okay.
So this is one of the panels of Jean Grey. Check this out.
We shouldn't have meddled! We shouldn't have meddled!
Oh man, you think that's bad? You should see what happens when it glitches.